Welcome to the Real Life Buyer podcast. In this podcast, you will hear interviews with business owners, entrepreneurs, thought leaders, authors, and technical specialists in their field. These professionals will hasten your development, accelerate your career, and broaden your business know-how. Now, introducing your host, Dave Barr, interviewing with a purchasing twist.
Hello, and welcome to the Real Life Buyer. In this episode, I am delighted to introduce you to Rodrigo Altaf. Rodrigo is based in Toronto and is the Senior Procurement Manager at Dragados Canada Inc., which specializes in studying, designing, and executing every kind of civil infrastructure or construction. Prior to this position, Rodrigo has held various procurement roles, including Regional Procurement Manager at GFL Environmental, Strategic Sourcing Manager at Holt Renfrew, and as a Procurement Analyst and Category Manager at Vale. These and other roles have given him international experience from Canada to Brazil, from Australia to Norway. For a more personal perspective on Rodrigo, he's also a heavy metal fan, following such bands as Iron Maiden, Van Halen, and AC/DC. But don't hold that against him. Today, Rodrigo and I are going to discuss strategic supplier alliances. So without further ado, I welcome Rodrigo onto the podcast. Hi, Rodrigo.
Hey, David. Thank you so much. Happy to be here. That was quite an introduction. How do I follow that?
Well, as long as you don't start singing, I think we'll be okay.
Awesome. We're free from that. Guaranteed.
Okay, cool. You do a little bit of air guitar if you fancy it, though. What the hell? Okay, so let's get to know you a little bit more. We obviously know your music preferences.
Yeah.
So how about the highlights of your backstory, the sort of motivations that drove you to choose procurement as your career choice?
Okay. So I graduated in civil engineering, actually, and I did have civil engineering roles. And what I usually say is that I didn't choose procurement. Procurement chose me. I was coming home from Australia, from living and working in Australia and going back to Brazil. A friend of mine he held a high position in a project that was starting in Rio. He needed someone to just write the specs for the piling and earthworks for a project. That's how I got into that role. And I wrote the specs. We sent it out to market and, we're manning up the project still. And he said, now that you wrote it and we got the bids, we might as well analyze it together and, choose a vendor. And, lo and behold, more packages started to come in. We needed to build that thing. And I sort of was driven into the sourcing and contract management of the packages for that plant that we were building. And so more roles followed after that. I went back to Australia eventually to work in the mining industry. Then 2017, we decided to migrate to Canada. And like you said in the intro, I've had several roles in here. I worked in mining here. Again, I worked in procurement for retail. Recently, I was in waste management and now construction back again. So it's like a full circle.
Yeah, it's a common, should we say, event where people say they've almost fallen into the roles of procurement. I have to say I did the same. I started out in quality management in manufacturing. And then for one reason or other, suddenly I found myself in procurement type engagements. And I kind of enjoyed talking to all these people and visiting their sites and learning about how they worked and started the kind of discussions. And just things went from there. It's rather bizarre, isn't it? But there's very few people who say from leaving college or university, oh, I want to be a procurement professional.
Yeah,
there we
exactly.
go.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's perhaps not quite so sexy as an astronaut, shall we say? But there we go.
Not at all. Yeah. I think it's changing now where we have like graduation in supply chain and procurement. People choose that path a little bit more so than in a few years back, like 10, 15 years ago. But yeah.
Yeah, it's you're rightly saying it's got more visibility than perhaps in the past. And I always say to people, particularly young people joining the profession, thinking of a young guy, how many roles can you say, other than perhaps sales, can you have the ability to go and visit other people, other places, locations, get involved in negotiations, interact with lots of people across, the business, across the globe. And so, for a young guy who's going to be able to perhaps travel from one country to the next, is quite an adventure. So, it's a lot of things to be said for it.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So at the moment, we've got a pretty evolving business landscape. There's an awful lot of disruption. We've gone through a fair bit of disruption in the last few years. It's still going on now for various unfortunate reasons, shall we say. However, forming strategic alliances with suppliers can bring a competitive advantage at times. Now, in your experience, I'm sure you've had some challenges, but also some success stories where an alliance has been created that's added value for both parties. I wonder if you could share with us a story, perhaps, of one of those examples.
Sure. So I can mention one thing from GFL, which was my previous role, because I'm fairly new to Dragados. It's been only 2.5 months, but at GFL is a massive organization in North America. They deal with waste management, and they have about 700 business units across the US and Canada. They're somewhat independently. They have their own P&L. They have their own independency to pick and choose their vendors. However, we do see a pattern in consumption for several different scopes like fuel, tires, machinery, industrial hoses, for example. And in my area of actuation, the areas where I provided support for, we did see a need for standardization in industrial hoses. We didn't have that. Each location bought their own hose, their own diameter, their own material. So we partnered with a company called Eric's, a distributor. They're a distributor, not a manufacturer. Yeah. However, they were able to map the consumption and to see a pattern in consumption of every location and come up with like a list of an equipment list that would, be a good fit for 90% of the locations, as opposed to each of them buying independently and choosing whatever hose diameter they would see fit, right? And then out of building that knowledge that we needed the vendor to build, because each location was independent, we didn't have someone overseeing this with a helicopter view. So we relied on the vendor. And there's pros and cons to this, right? First of all, we needed a vendor with as broad a presence as possible. They're spread across North America with a presence that almost matched the locations of the business units. And the other thing too, it might not necessarily be the lowest costing option, but they had the ability to map that consumption. They were the only vendor that was robust enough to put that in place and help us through that journey, right? And I guess the saving would not come from the unit price, but it would come from standardization. That was the point. Okay.
Yeah, I certainly know Eric's is a huge company in its own right.
Yeah.
As you say, they have their own expertise in, for example, this area that you just mentioned. So you're pulling on that expertise. They're helping you, as you said, by going in, exploring what's being done, talking to the local people, getting all the facts, the specifications, and they're delivering that package to you, that package of knowledge, as well as the suite of hoses in this case that you would be looking to purchase. Did you struggle with any pushback from some of those locations when that was ongoing?
100%. Yeah, because there's a lot of remote locations where people are used to buying from the mom and pop store around the corner, which was, the easy fix. And also there's locations where, these business units would also service their vendors, right? So in that case, it wouldn't really make sense to replace them for Eric's or for any other vendor that we would introduce. And there's other cases like that, like fuel, for example. We drove the use of Petro-Canada, but there are certain locations where the vendor of fuel is also one of our biggest customers. So you tended to kind of back off and, okay, for that location, this agreement does not apply. However, please consider that in the future. And, we always plant that seed for the future. And once they see the benefit elsewhere, they might or might not adhere to the contract. We don't know, right?
Yeah, understood.
Yeah.
Now, what this creates, you've got an alliance here, strategic alliance. I think that's the key thing is the element of strategy here. But that requires a certain amount of trust and definitely collaboration.
Yeah.
So what steps do you recommend for building strong relationships with suppliers? You didn't suddenly engage, no doubt, with Eric's and say, hey, do you want to do all this work for me? I should think there have been a fair bit of history between the parties.
Yeah.
How can organizations ensure the alignment of goals and objectives as well? So you've got the trust element, you need the relationship, you've got to collaborate, you've got to have similar goals and objectives. What are your thoughts on this? And how to deal with that, for some ways, complicated mixture?
Yeah. So in that case, Eric's was already a vendor for several locations. However, if you're starting from scratch, I'm a firm believer in memo, which is meet early, meet often. The more you meet, the more you set the expectations, the more you mitigate the risk, right? I guess you need to ensure that there's a common understanding and an alignment of values, right? Like you wouldn't pair Philip Morris with a wellness company, right? So there has to be a minimum alignment of values. That's the first thing. Common goals to be reached, right? Clear objectives from both sides. Like I want to mitigate this issue, and I believe that this vendor has the expertise. They have the material. They have the human factor to mitigate what I'm trying to mitigate, etc. And it's almost like you're doing not just integrity due diligence. It's more like an extended version of that. You have to have, and not just human rights violation or corruption cases mitigated, but also an alignment in terms of the future goals and the values of both partners, right? So that's one thing. Another thing I would say, depending on what you're aligning for or reaching an agreement for, there might be a lot of research and development involved. Like, for example, Rio Tinto, they partnered with Komatsu to come up with mining of the future, where they develop these automated haulage trucks. It's a lot of research, development, new technologies being introduced. So it's important to have all the relevant NDAs in place. You need to find out from the get-go who's going to get the intellectual property once the partnership moves in different directions, right? And from a customer perspective, have a fallback strategy. Like if something fails or goes south, or suppose there's a natural disaster and they cannot deliver, have a different vendor that might be or of the same stature or not, but that can mitigate somehow the issues that you face along the way, right? And also KPIs are important too. Like you need to meet every quarter or every month if necessary to look at how things are going. Are both sides getting the best of the relationship or not, right?
Yeah. Now, sometimes, not to say always, but sometimes you need to partner or have an alliance with a supplier who can also be in some way, shape or form a competitor. Have you had any experience of that? And what did you find were the difficulties and the benefits of that kind of relationship?
Right. So I myself have not established that kind of relationship. However, at Dragados, for example, our customers are public entities like Metrolinx here, which deals with infrastructure. So we partner with other construction companies all the time, right? Each contract that we get into is with a different partner. The players here, it's a small market, so the players are essentially the same. I guess the biggest issues that are always discussed are NDAs, again, intellectual property, who's going to have a say in the vendor selection, and also a fallback strategy as well. If things go south, how to mitigate that, right? Risk, insurance, all these things that you deal with the smallest of vendor take a lot of prevalence when you're dealing with a competitor, right? The stakes are way higher at that level. So yeah, but I would say as well, the more equal your partner is at this stage, the more senior the executives need to be, or you would involve like a C-suite in cases like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But you say it can be very beneficial for both parties. That's the key, is that it's got to be a mutual benefit at the end of the day. And at times you've got to really, should we say, get rid of some of the politics involved with these things. Have, as you say, the correct things in place, but the respect on both sides to recognize where the lines should be drawn and how to manage those difficult fine lines that sometimes crop up. That's all about discussion, about partnership, about collaboration, and having the right mindset between the parties, isn't it?
Absolutely. And there's curious cases in here where we do partnerships with certain companies that in other contracts, they are our vendors. So meeting early, meeting often, and spreading the news about what's going on, getting multiple disciplines involved like health and safety, risk management, legal, procurement, and the technical expertise as well. Technical area is key for the success, right?
Yeah. Cool. So when we form a strategic alliance, what's critical, and we mentioned the example earlier on, was that we find the right partner. Okay, there can be large entities that are out there that can give the competence and experience you need, but they may not be a good cultural fit, perhaps. I'm thinking now, what kind of criteria or factors should organizations consider when selecting partners, some alliances? How can they assess the capability of each party's strategic vision, for example, particularly when they're based in different regions of the world?
Yeah, and like I said at some point, it's like an extended integrity due diligence where you evaluate their financials. What are your goals? What's your vision? What's your 5-year, 10-year plan, if possible, right? How did you mitigate issue XYZ? How would you mitigate, how do we see the risks and opportunities in the future? How do you plan to tackle that, right? When you're dealing with companies that are in different countries, a lot of things need to be taken into account. Cultural differences, different time zones, like disruption in terms of wars and sanctions, right? Natural disasters. So I guess a robust risk matrix for this is key, right? Also intellectual property as well, and NDAs, they need to be put in place as early as possible. And meeting and talking, right? If need be, just travel there, just go there physically, meet them face to face. It does make a great difference when you meet people face to face. I've experienced that at GFL and also at Dragados. Like when you show your face, the level of trust just escalates, dramatically, right? So yeah, I would say meet early, meet often, meet in person if possible. Try to look for common ground, which is something that every team can benefit from. Have KPIs in place that would evaluate the partnership from time to time and see, does it make sense? Does it not make sense, right? And have time-bound agreements and goals as well. Like if it gets to a point where X, Y, Z objectives have not been reached, just, consider a different source, a different vendor, right?
Yeah. I quite agree that meeting in person is essential. We have perhaps come extremely reliant on video calls like this, Zooms and Teams and everything else, all these other technologies. But there is no way that you can really build a person-to-person relationship by having a visual chat. Sometimes it's been involved, as you say, in the same company. If you're both going to go into a particular area, you experience meals together, you'll have a few beers together, you start talking about each other as individuals, not necessarily just in the role. It's surprising how you can start to form a different impression of people when you're face to face. I would say they're always positive, because sometimes you need to know when there's going to be conflicts, where people don't have the same viewpoint. They don't have the same, should we say, thought on how to go about the task.
Yeah.
And the only way to really get to that level isn't through a video call. It is through person-to-person contact. And you can get a much better feeling for their thoughts, their beliefs, the way they behave, how they engage with their colleagues, how they engage with you and your colleagues. It's all about people-to-people interaction. And of course, if you're bringing two sides together, those teams need to gel. They need to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses, understand the way of working, understand the language. Sometimes the technicalities of language can be difficult, particularly if you're from different regions of the world, different ways of explaining things. 100%. So it can be quite tough, can't it? Actually?
Absolutely. Yeah. And where I travel to a different country to do business, like a country that does not speak English, for example, or like I traveled to Norway for business. It's a completely different setting. Building that trust was key for the success that I achieved when working for that company. So I would strongly recommend it, particularly if the language is different, right? Yeah. Showing your face, building that trust, shaking hands goes a long way.
Yeah. I often found that having an event in the evening, if it's just, go to a place where you can do a little bit of sport together, be it a little bit of football, or if you're in a cold country, do something on an ice rink. That kind of, excuse the pun, but it does break the ice somewhat. You start to have a bit of fun sometimes as well.
Yeah.
And that counts for a lot when you're building a relationship. You can come back the next day and have a bit of a laugh about how things were. I've been on events where in the evening the guys played 10-pin bowling or something. So there's a little bit of competition, but it was a good laugh as well at the same time. So
Right.
I think that does help. You need to get out of the work environment so you can get back into the work environment sometimes, because the dynamic can change quite significantly the next day.
100%. Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of very good points earlier about intellectual property, maintaining confidentiality as well. People are going to be perhaps in an environment, they'll see more than they would normally do. There's only so much you can do to hide things away, shall we say, if you want to call it that you don't want to share.
Yeah.
But you've still got to have a collaborative environment, and you still want to be innovative with these people.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the legalese, shall we say, the NDAs and the IP rights, etc., can be a hindrance.
Yeah.
If you found any particular ways of trying to bridging that kind of gap, where you've got to share so much sensitive information, but not to a degree that is uncomfortable, if you had that problem to deal with?
I don't have a recipe for that. Just try and be transparent and be honest about it. Like there's things that we disclose to the vendors and say, I feel that there's something in the pipeline in terms of acquisition or divestment or something like that. This is what I can see and what I can share in terms of the future for this company. Take that as you want and plan to work with us, how you want it. But yeah, I think you have to be transparent and know and share what you know, and what you don't know. That's the only way I can describe it. Be transparent and avoid hiccups, right? So if a vendor hits me with a price increase out of the blue, that trust is lost, right? So to regain that trust, it's a process, right? And yeah, I would say be as transparent as you can from both sides, knowing that at any point you could be sidelined by a business decision that you had no interference of or no interference in, right?
Yeah.
Transparency.
Yeah. You hit a particular word there, which is always going to be a challenge, is price. Now, both parties have their own feelings on how the costs have got to, the calculations been performed. Sometimes you need to get those numbers out on the table, understand each other's viewpoints, where they're getting their data from. And obviously the word margin can also be, should we say, a difficult one to overcome.
Yeah.
Don't attack the margin, attack the costs is what I say.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody needs to make money. That's what we're out here to do. We've got to pay each other's wages and such. But if you can find ways of doing things more efficiently together, or perhaps there's some intelligence that is out there that you are able to share, did you know about this, etc., that isn't going to compromise yourself, then let's help each other in this respect. They can share something with you as well. They might have a particular competence in an area where you're perhaps a little bit weaker on, etc.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you can use those skills. Yeah.
Yeah. I think for Canada, a lot of the companies here don't know what they purchase. There's no, the ERP systems sometimes are not robust enough, or they are robust, but they're not used to full capacity. So knowing your consumption details, what you buy in the long run, can be challenging. So a lot of times we rely on the vendors to tell us, hey, you consumed XYZ or this amount of hours of rental equipment within a year in this or that location. So that level of trust, you have to be able to trust the vendors to tell you what you consumed. That for me was a mountain to overcome, to be honest with you, because I'm used to knowing and telling them, hey, I bought this from you. But no, it's reversed in here. By and large, it's reversed, right? So that level of trust is, you either trust it or you don't even do business with that vendor. So
yeah, a lot of the times it's all in the data, isn't it?
Yeah.
The people who have the greatest detail, greatest information, the newest information can sometimes have an advantage, shall we say?
Yeah.
And as a buyer, you want to have the cleanest data possible that gives you the overview, the spread that you need to discuss things. And when the vendor has to bring that to the table, say, did you realize?
How do you know about my business more than I know, right? Yeah.
But that, as you say, sometimes that is their business, should we say? And so their expertise is that, well, as we mentioned earlier on, in some ways, they can share stuff that could be very useful to you. Did you know that you can use an alternative shape, size, material, X, Y, and Z that will give you the same benefits, but at a lower cost?
Yeah.
Now, quite often that can be the case because their individual expertise in that area is the kind of thing that you're lacking. You can't be an expert in everything.
Yeah.
So there has to be some give and take with that information.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Now, obviously, alliances, when they're set up, hopefully everything goes very well. And over time, though, things can change. Events change in the world, different factors change. So, what do you think are some good ways of organizations proactively managing and maintaining those alliances, keeping those relationships healthy? You mentioned a few things earlier on. You say dramatic things are happening in the world right now, political, shall we say, very uncomfortable things. And so, people's beliefs can be affected. The markets change quickly. We've seen some major ups and downs in particular materials, for example, in the pricing. The business needs change. What kind of things have you done to make sure that the relationship tries to stay on track despite all these other things happening?
Right. So I can give an example of oil and gas where I worked in oil and gas. In Brazil, in particular, there's not too many players, not too many vendors for oil and gas for specific scopes like drilling and completion. There's 3 or 4 players, right? We had contracts with all of them, and we would meet every 3 months to discuss their performance, and they would score our performance as well as customers, right? In front of everyone. So we would have 3 or 4 vendors give their opinion on us, and we would give our opinion on them in front of their competitors, right? That could be embarrassing in the first instances, but over time, that builds trust. And also being transparent about what you know, what you don't know about the future. So we have this uncertainty, and this is how we're preparing for it. Does your supply chain align with how we see this uncertainty? What contingencies do you have down the line for scenario A, B, or C? Having them be part of your strategic objectives and maybe providing info and input to your strategic goals in the future, in the 2 or 3 years that you can see in the horizon. Nowadays, it's even shorter, 6 months, one year, right? But having them do that input to you and feeding back to them, hey, I think it's going to look like this in the upcoming year. What are your thoughts, right? Involving them in each and every step of the way, wherever possible, it builds that trust and shares the risk as well. Sometimes you need to place a PO for raw material that will cover you for 6 months or a year, but you're like, maybe not all of this will be consumed. So where do I store this if the demand changes, right? Nowadays, we're dealing with dramatic demand changes because, we're still living the hiccups of COVID. Like, how do you plan for the uncertainties in the future? There's war everywhere, an economic crisis looming around the corner. How do you plan for that? It's unpredictable, really, right? So sharing risk, sharing your vision of the future with a vendor goes a long way because he can then plan for that uncertainty as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. You'll have so much history, but history necessarily doesn't repeat itself at the right time.
Yeah.
It will sometime, but it won't be at the right time. Exactly. Yeah. And as you say, they may have a better understanding of certain markets than you. And so they could bring suggestions and say, well, hey, our forecast for these materials based on what we know suggests that we need to approach this in a different way going forwards. May we suggest X, Y, and Z? I think that can be very helpful to a buyer to see that perspective. And equally, you as a buyer will have hopefully some visibility from your sales organization on how they see things going in the future. It's that mutual sharing of information and trying to get the best for each party that can be quite critical.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Find it really interesting, and I was quite pleased to hear you mention the fact that not only do you evaluate the supplier, but you welcome the supplier to evaluate you.
Yeah.
That is, as you say, it's uncomfortable sometimes, but necessary. There are too many, in my opinion, buyers who will quite happily berate or show up suppliers for not performing in all areas, but quite often do not welcome or are uncomfortable with the same critique. We're saying, well, you as the customer, if you had helped us or told us about X, Y, and Z, this could have been a different outcome.
Yeah.
So when you're in that kind of situation, how did you help those people around you from your side cope with the fact that they are going to be critiqued? What was the way of aligning everybody so that they weren't reacting in a negative way when perhaps some uncomfortable truths came out?
Right. Good question. Good question. It was a learning curve for us. This was unique for that company in Brazil, and it was a Norwegian company, and I do not think this was employed elsewhere, but in Brazil, it was an idea that came from one of the directors, and it was implemented. Like, I think that over time, people learned to live with that criticism, and took that seriously, and did take that criticism to try and improve in the next quarter. But initially, there was that shock, like, how dare you criticize me? I'm the customer. I'm paying your bills. I'm paying your salaries, right? But you learn to appreciate your limitations, and you learn to try and mitigate them, so that the next time, because this involved like senior leadership all the way down to, the most regular person in the company, right? The engineers, right? It was a bit of a learning curve. Some of the feedback was really harsh in the beginning, but people learn to live with that, and learn to act on it and improve on it, right? Particularly in health and safety, where there was a little bit of a competition between the vendors to see who performed better. So that drove results, right? We lower every statistic in terms of health and safety. So over time, it proved to be successful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's, or I equate it to sometimes. You see these shows on TV when the owner of the business goes in disguise or goes to part of their organization and see it from the ground up. Now, when we're working in our specific offices, locations, we see to a certain degree what's happening, but you're not the customer, you're not the supplier, you're not feeling the changes or the difficulties that your business is actually revealing to them. Now, It's great when those CEOs go to the shop floor and find out, actually, what I perceive to be happening is very different to reality.
Yeah.
And that's the only way for you to learn how to improve sometimes. Be aware of those things.
Yeah.
Even though it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You shouldn't always expect your customer to be the one to tell you this isn't right and change this. It should go both ways, in my opinion.
100%. And there was a case where, the door of a drilling unit in the rig actually fell down to the drilling floor. It didn't hit anyone, but it could have been catastrophic, right? So the country president of the company I was working for, it was the customer at the time. They called the vendor's country president on the meeting to explain what happened, and to, not to berate him, but to ask for an explanation of what happened. How are you going to mitigate that moving forward? What are the steps that we need to take for that not to happen? And how do we change our culture, our behavior in terms of health and safety to avoid that from happening and from having catastrophic consequences, right? So,
yeah.
You
never want to be in a situation, you rightly say, where there's a health and safety incident. And actually, that's a classic example where bringing together expertise from both sides, it's all about making an environment safe for everybody who are working in that process.
Yeah.
It isn't about scoring points. It's about keeping people safe. So I think it is a very good example of where collaboration clearly is for the benefit of everybody. So I do like that example.
Yeah.
Now, before I jump on to the last question, seeing time is absolutely flying by, what's the best way for people to find out more about you and what you do?
I'm on LinkedIn. You can add me, Rodrigo Altaf. I'm very approachable on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook as well. I do interviews with rock musicians as well. There's a website called Sonic Perspectives. You'll find me there on the Sonic Perspectives YouTube channel. Also, you can reach me on rodrigo.altaf@gmail.com. Yeah, I'm very approachable on social media. Just don't hesitate to reach out to me. It'd be great to connect with other professionals around the world. Yeah, happy to connect, discuss whatever improvements and whatever situations you're facing. I do help newcomers to Canada, particularly in the Brazilian community, to help find jobs. I do a little bit of mentoring and coaching here. I look at resumes and try to match them with positions that I know are vacant. So yeah, do reach out. Be happy to connect.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. So just looking now from a perspective of a young person in buying, somebody who's perhaps got a few years under their belt, they're getting involved in bigger projects, and now they're faced with the potential for an alliance. What kind of things would you recommend to those people who are perhaps fairly early in their careers, what sort of desktop things, perhaps, what sort of activities do you think they could do to identify the potential risks and benefits, how they map out how they should go about incorporating a supplier into their business in such a way as that you'll get the best out for both parties? That alliance can really propagate and help both parties to develop and grow together.
So I would say look at history, first and foremost, the history of the vendor, the history of your company, what it's done so far, and what are the objectives moving forward. What is the strategic planning for that company? Does it match the strategic goals of the vendors you're selecting, right? That's one thing. Involve multiple disciplines, right? When you're evaluating a vendor, bring the health and safety guy, bring the technical guy with you to evaluate the expertise, the focus on research and development. What is the attention to new trends? How do you adapt to the current uncertainties, right? Things like that. How do you mitigate risk, right? Risk is something that is like, it's kind of, I don't want to say it's brand new, but it's an infant discussion that we have in terms of risk, mitigating risk, right? Particularly now in the aftermath of COVID, where we had so many disruptions that people weren't used to living with. But yeah, look at not just price, not just technical ability, look at multiple factors of that vendor that would enable you to, put their name forward as a particular good partner, right? As a strong partnership, right? Evaluate multiple layers, multiple levels, multiple disciplines, right?
Yeah, no, I really like that. I'm always the advocate for bringing people together. And I'm glad you mentioned about other parties, because people think procurement, those guys should kind of know everything. Absolutely not. What I love to do is engage my colleagues, as you say, from perhaps production, health and safety, from quality, from machining to assembly, all those skill sets. Those people have an expertise in their own area, and to match those people with the supplier's equivalents, and in a formal way where you have an open discussions. There's so many different things that come out of those meetings. It can be quite incredible. Things that I never thought of suddenly come out, where an expertise in one area strikes a chord with the expertise in your area and vice versa. And out of that, should we say, meeting of minds, where they visit you, you visit them, suddenly you start to form quite a healthy list of things that you can both work on together. It drives innovation. People, as you mentioned earlier on, stop putting their arms around a problem to hide things. They open things up. And so both parties can get benefits from that. And as you say, the relationships build. And before you know it, the R&D guys we mentioned earlier on suddenly are opened up to new opportunities, perhaps new methods of manufacture, new materials they hadn't considered. I think those things seriously can impact a business in a very positive way, both financially and operationally. Have you seen the same thing?
I have, yeah. And the thing I could add to that is the answer might not be so clear-cut in most cases. That I feel that can be frustrating for the newer generation who are not used to pushbacks and frustrations. Maybe you select a vendor that is good at expertise A, B, or C, but D, E, and F would fall under a different vendor. But you're selecting this one now because it makes sense in your view, right? Be prepared for pushbacks, right? You might get adherence from 80% of your business units, but not 100%. In that sense, how much uncertainty can you live with, right? Does it have to make sense for all locations? Maybe, maybe not, right? Be prepared for that. There will be pushbacks, and you need to live with that frustration. Sometimes you have the answer for the pushbacks, sometimes you won't, right?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it's good that if you find that they're not the right partner for you, they may be at a different place in their journey where there isn't going to be the synergies that are needed to make the change, to make the move forward. And that's a good thing to know. There's no point wasting each other's time if actually they're not the best fit for you at your point of your journey. So yeah, I think we've had some pretty good discussions there. Some interesting stuff come out.
Agreed.
Hopefully, everybody will find that of great use to themselves and their careers.
I hope so. Happy to contribute. Yeah, feel free to reach out, and always happy to have a discussion about all things procurement and supply chain.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for your time today, Rodrigo. It's been brilliant talking to you.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye.
So there's another Real Life Buyer podcast. I do hope you enjoyed it, and it has given you some ideas and inspiration for greater action and achievement. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes, and a 5-star review would be most appreciated. If you would like to discover more about me and what I do, take a look at www.thereallifebuyer.co.uk. Bye.